When most people hear the word Venezuela, they think of crisis. They think of inflation, political instability, migration. Maybe they remember a headline they saw years ago, or a news clip they scrolled past online. For me, Venezuela is something much more personal. It's family, it's memories, it's stories passed down through phone calls and conversations. It's a place where my parents still live. It's a country that shaped who I am, even though I live outside of it. And yet, over the last decade, Venezuela has become connected to something much larger than itself. Today, Venezuela sits as the intersection of some of the biggest geopolitical questions over time. Questions about power, questions about influence, questions about who shapes the future of the international system. Why are the United States, China, and Russia all interested in Venezuela? Why does a country of roughly 28 million people continue to attract global attention? And what can Venezuela teach us about the return of great power rivalry in the 21st century? I'm Melissa Calderon Bracho, and this is an episode 1 of my podcast exploring Venezuela, geopolitics, and global power. To understand Venezuela's place in global politics, we first need to understand why the country matters. At first glance, Venezuela might seem like an unlikely focus of international competition. It isn't on the world's largest economies, it isn't military superpower, and yet Venezuela possesses something that has shaped its history for more than a century: oil. According to energy data, Venezuela holds some of the largest proven oil reserves in the world. For decades, oil transformed Venezuela into one of Latin America's wealthiest nations. Throughout much of the 20th century, oil exports generated enormous government revenue and connected Venezuela to global markets. The country's economy became deeply dependent on petroleum. And that's where part of the history begins. Because when a nation's prosperity depends heavily on a single resource, it becomes vulnerable when that resource changes. Economists often refer to this as the resource curse. Natural resources can create wealth, but they can also create dependency. And in Venezuela's case, oil became both a blessing and a challenge. For many years, high oil prices helped fund government programs and public spending. But dependence on oil also meant that economic stability became tied to global energy markets. When oil prices fell dramatically during the 2010s, Venezuela faced a crisis that exposed deeper structural weaknesses. But before we get there, we need to talk about another key figure in its history: Hugo Chavez. Chavez became a president in 1999 and remained one of the most controversial political leaders in modern Latin America history. Supporters view him as a champion of social progress and national sovereignty, while others accuse him of undermining democratic institutions and concentrating power. Regardless of political perspective, Chavez transformed Venezuelan politics one way or the other. He also reshaped Venezuela's foreign policy. Under Chavez, Venezuela sought closer relationship with countries such as China and Russia while challenging American influence in the region. These relationships will become increasingly important in the years ahead. Then, in March of 2013, Chavez died. His successor, Nicolás Maduro, inherited a country already facing significant political and economic challenges. And this moment marks the beginning of the timeline for this project. Because after 2013, several developments occurred simultaneously. Oil prices declined, political tensions intensified, economic conditions worsened, and international attention toward Venezuela increased. By the middle of the decade, Venezuela was experiencing one of the most severe economic crises in its modern history. Inflation soared, shortages became common, economic output shrank dramatically. The crisis affected nearly every aspect of daily life. But this was not longer just a domestic story. It was becoming an international one. And this is where our discussion shifts from Venezuela's international challenge to the broader geopolitical landscape. To understand why Venezuela became so important internationally, we need to examine 3 major actors: the United States, China, and Russia. Let's start with the United States. For much of the 20th century, the United States was the dominant external power in Latin America. Political developments throughout the region often carried implications for American foreign policy. Relations between Washington and Caracas became increasingly strained during the Chavez years and remained tense under Maduro. American officials expressed concerns about democracy, governance, and human rights. Over time, the United States imposed a variety of sanctions on the Venezuela government in key sectors of the economy. Supporters of sanctions argue that they were necessarily tools to pressure the government. Critics argue that sanctions contributed to economic hardship. These sanctions, at the end of the day, became an important part of the international response to Venezuela's crisis. But while relations with the United States deteriorated, Venezuela strengthened ties with another major power, China. China's growing presence in Latin America represents one of the most significant geopolitical developments of the 21st century. Over the past 2 decades, China has invested heavily across the region: infrastructure, trade, energy, finance. Venezuela became one of China's most important partners. Chinese institutions provided millions and billions of dollars in loans. Energy cooperation expanded, economic ties deepened. For China, Venezuela offered access to valuable natural resources and a strategic partnership in the Western Hemisphere. For Venezuela, China represented an alternative source of financing and international support. The relationship reflected broader changes occurring throughout the global system. A world once dominated primarily by the United States was becoming increasingly multipolar. And then there's Russia. Although Russia's economic relationship with Venezuela is smaller than China's, its political significance is considerable. Russia has provided diplomatic support, military cooperation, and strategic backing to the Maduro government. Why? Part of the answer involves global influence. Russia has long sought opportunities to expand its presence beyond its immediate region. Maintaining ties with Venezuela provides Moscow with a partner in a region historically associated with American influence. In many ways, Venezuela became a symbol, not simply a country experiencing domestic turmoil, but a place where larger political tensions intersected. This brings us to one of the most important questions of this episode. What does Venezuela reveal about the international system today? For a moment, let's zoom out. After the Cold War ended in 1991, many scholars believed the world was entering a relatively stable era. Some argue that ideological competition between major powers had largely been resolved. Globalization expanded, trade increased, international cooperation appeared to be growing, but the world today looks very different. Tensions between the United States and China have intensified. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has reshaped European security. Conflicts continue across multiple regions. Increasingly, policymakers and scholars discuss the return of great power competition, not necessarily a new Cold War, but certainly a war characterized by growing rivalry among powerful states. And this is why Venezuela matters, because Venezuela demonstrates how these rivalries do not exist only in places like Eastern Europe or East Asia. They also shape developments in Latin America. A country facing domestic political and economic challenges became intertwined with broader struggles over influence, power, and international order. And yet, focusing only on governments and world powers risks missing something important: the people. Because behind every discussion about sanctions, diplomacy, oil, and geopolitical competition are millions of individuals trying to navigate daily life. Families, communities, students, workers, people making difficult decisions about their futures. Because in March 2013, Hugo Chavez died after battling cancer. His vice president, Nicolás Maduro, assumed the presidency. Many historians point to this moment as a turning point in Venezuela's modern history. And it's also why my project begins in 2013. Not because Venezuela's problems began that year, they didn't. Rather than 2013 marks the beginning of a new chapter, one where domestic political tensions, economic challenges, and international rivalries will become increasingly interconnected. In many ways, this is where the story we're telling truly begins. Because over the next decade, Venezuela will become far more than a country experiencing an international political crisis. It will become a stage upon which some of the world's most powerful nations competed for influence. And that's exactly where we're headed next. In the next part of this episode, we'll examine how failing oil prices, economic instability, and political conflict transformed Venezuela from a domestic crisis into an issue of global significance. and why the United States, China, and Russia all believed they had something to gain or lose from what happened there. When we left off, Venezuela was standing at a crossroads. It was a country blessed with extraordinary natural resources, a country whose economy had been transformed by oil, a country whose politics had been reshaped. But in March 2013, things changed. After battling cancer for nearly 2 years, Hugo Chavez dies. This marked a lot of uncertainty. A lot of people worry about the concentration of power, the weakening of democratic institutions, an economy that had become increasingly dependent on high oil prices to sustain government spending already. Regardless, one thing was undeniable. The country was entering a new era, and the man stepping into that era was Nicolás Maduro. Another thing to add is that even though when Chavez was in power, and by this time, we don't necessarily have what we know of today of Venezuela, where a lot of people, regardless of who they vote, the votes are definitely transformed by the government to be what they want. A lot of people even today are not necessarily in agreement that Chavez was a good decision. But the truth is, a lot of Venezuelans did vote it for him. So you could say that Chavez was a turning point of sort of Venezuela's crisis and democracy, but at the same time, it isn't what we know of today with elections, where a lot of the times those elections are not counted correctly and are very much unfair for the people and the people's opinions and voice. So that's one thing to clarify as well. So by this era, we already experienced a lot of issues. So Maduro had served as Venezuela's foreign minister and later as vice president. Unlike Chavez, he had never been a military officer, nor did he possess the same political presence at that time. Even many supporters acknowledged that Chavez had apparently a unique ability to connect with ordinary Venezuelans, or like the hardworking people of Venezuela. And that's sort of how he got so many of his votes. And yeah, to this day, we have people that still live in Venezuela or Venezuelans around the world who, supported Chavez at first. I think a lot of people definitely have regrets to an extent, since, once again, that was a turning point of the country being what it is today, which isn't in its greatest shape. In April 2013, Maduro narrowly won the presidential election by less than 2 percentage points. The election itself reflected a country that was becoming increasingly polarized, because nearly half of Venezuelans that supported Maduro because they supported Chavez, but then again, Maduro was just sort of put into presidency just because he was Chavez's right hand. So a lot of Venezuelans also didn't have a lot that they could say or do. And obviously, a big majority still supported the opposition. And by this time, that even though Chavez wasn't president, again, we have an increased amount of people who not longer agree with Chavez's values and not longer also want Maduro either. So it was clear that this whole presidency and governing would not be easy. But a political division posed one challenge, an even larger one was just around the corner, and that was oil. To understand what happened next, imagine running a business where almost all of your income comes from one customer. And as long as that customer keeps paying, everything seems fine. But if that customer suddenly stops buying, your entire business is in trouble. That was Venezuela's economy. For decades, oil had been the engine that powered the country. By the early 2010s, oil accounted for roughly 95% of Venezuela's export earnings and generated much of the government's revenue. Programs that funded housing, education, food subsidies, and healthcare depended heavily on income from oil exports. As long as oil prices remained high, the model appeared sustainable. But history has a way of testing systems that depend on a single source of income. In 2014, global oil prices collapsed. The price of a barrel of oil fell by more than a half in a matter of months. For oil-producing countries, this was a serious challenge. For Venezuela, it was catastrophic. Government revenue shrank dramatically, imports declined, businesses struggled to obtain foreign currency, factories slowed down production, basic goods became increasingly difficult to find, some shortages affected everyday life, families waited in long lines hoping to buy basic items such as flour, cooking oil, diapers, or medicine. Hospitals reported shortages of medical supplies. Power outages became increasingly common in parts of the country. Inflation accelerated rapidly. Long lines for gasoline. Eventually, economists described Venezuela's economy as experiencing hyperinflation, one of the most extreme episodes in modern history. Imagine being paid on Friday only to discover that by Monday, your salary could buy significantly less than it had just a few days earlier. Savings disappeared, businesses closed. For many Venezuelans, the future became increasingly uncertain. Now, it's important to pause here, because economists continue to debate exactly why Venezuela's economy collapsed. There isn't one universally accepted explanation. Instead, most scholars point to a combination of factors. Supporters of the Maduro government argue that falling of oil prices and international sanctions, economic warfare, and external pressure significantly worsened the crisis. Others argue that years of economic mismanagement, corruption, price controls, declining oil production, and weakened institutions had already placed the economy on an unsustainable path long before sanctions expanded. Many researchers suggest the reality includes elements of both. So the collapse wasn't caused by a single event. It was a result of multiple economic and political pressures colliding at the same time. And this is where Venezuela's story begins to shift from a domestic crisis to an international one. Because as conditions inside Venezuela deteriorated, governments around the world began asking a difficult question. What should we do? Should other countries intervene diplomatically? Should they oppose sanctions? Should they recognize Maduro as Venezuela's legitimately president? Or should they support the growing opposition movement? There weren't just questions about Venezuela anymore. There were questions about democracy, national sovereignty, human rights, international law, and global influence. Suddenly, what happened in Caracas mattered in Washington. It mattered in Beijing. It mattered in Moscow. Because Venezuela was no longer simply an oil-producing nation facing economic hardship. It became something much larger. It had become a test of competing visions for the international order. Should powerful countries intervene when they believe democracy is under threat, or should national sovereignty remain the guiding principle, even during political crisis? Those questions don't have an easy answer, and different countries answer them in very different ways. The United States increasingly viewed the Maduro government as authoritarian and expanded diplomatic and economic pressure. China emphasized non-interference while continuing to protect many of its own economic interests. Russia openly backed Maduro, arguing that foreign governments should not determine Venezuela's political future. Three global powers, three very different responses. And each response reflected a broader idea about how the world should work. By the middle of the decade, Venezuela had become much more than a country in crisis. It had become a geopolitical crossroads, a place where questions about democracy, sovereignty, energy, security, and global influence all collide. But the biggest confrontation was still to come. In January 2019, Venezuela will experience one of the most dramatic political crises in its modern history. One president claimed victory, another claimed legitimacy, more than 50 countries chose sides, and suddenly the rest of the world was forced to answer a question that still shapes international policy today. Who gets to decide who governs a nation? Its own people, its constitution, or the international community? That's where we'll go next. Because this is the moment when Venezuela stopped being just a nation in crisis and became one of the defining geopolitical flat points of the 21st century. By 2016, the country's political and economic problems had become impossible for the rest of the world to ignore. Inflation continued to soar. The economy continued to shrink. Hospitals struggled with shortages of supplies. Power outages became more frequent. And more Venezuelans began making an impossible decision: to leave. For decades, Venezuela had welcomed immigrants from around the world. Now, for the first time in its modern history, millions of Venezuelans were leaving in search of stability. Some crossed into Colombia carrying only a backpack, others traveled south to Peru, Ecuador, Chile, or Brazil. Many reunited with relatives abroad. others left without knowing when or if they would return. This growing immigration crisis wasn't just changing Venezuela, it was changing Latin America. Neighboring governments suddenly faced new questions. How should they respond? How many people could they receive? How would immigration reshape their own economies and politics? What had begun as a domestic crisis was becoming a regional one, and soon, a global one. By 2016, Venezuela's opposition-controlled National Assembly attempted to challenge President Nicolás Maduro's authority. Political tensions escalated rapidly. The government and opposition increasingly accused one another of violating democratic principles and the Constitution. International observers watched closely. The question was no longer simply whether Venezuela was experiencing an economic collapse. The question had become, was Venezuela still a democracy? Different governments answered that question very differently. For the United States, concern about Venezuela had been growing for years. Administration criticized democratic backsliding, restrictions on opposition leaders, and allegations of human rights abuses. In 2015, the Obama administration declared Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat to U.S. national security, a legal designation used to authorize targeted sanctions. At the time, the sanctions were aimed primarily at specific government officials rather than the broader Venezuelan economy. Supporters argue that these measures held officials accountable for alleged abuse without directly harming ordinary citizens. Critics question both the designation itself and whether sanctions will ultimately encourage political change. Those debates will only intensify in the years ahead. When Donald Trump entered office in 2017, U.S. policy became significantly more aggressive. The administration expanded sanctions, particularly against Venezuela's financial sector and later its oil industry. The goal, according to the U.S. officials, was clear: increase pressure on the Maduro government until it agreed to democratic reforms or step aside. Supporters believe sanctions were one of the few peaceful tools available to pressure an increasingly authoritarian government. They argue that doing nothing will legitimize democratic erosion and human rights violations. But critics, including some economists, humanitarian organizations, and policy analysts, wanted that broad economic sanctions risk worsening an already severe humanitarian crisis. They argue that while many of Venezuela's economic problems predated the sanctions, later restrictions on the oil sector reduced government revenue even further, making recovery more difficult. Today, scholars continue to debate the precise impact of sanctions. Most agreed they were not the original cause of Venezuela's economic collapse. However, many also argue that sanctions became one of factors among several that shaped the country's worsening humanitarian situation. As we'll see throughout this podcast, international relations rarely offer simple answers. Policies often produce intended consequences and unintended ones. While Washington was increasing pressure, Beijing was watching carefully. China's relationship with Venezuela stretched back years. Between the mid-2000s and the 2010s, Chinese banks extended tens of billions of dollars in loans to Venezuela, many of them backed by future oil shipments. For China, Venezuela represented more than just another trading partner. It was part of a broader strategy. As China's economy expanded, so did its demand for energy. Recurring, reliable access to oil became a national priority. But economics wasn't the only reason. China was also expanding its diplomatic influence throughout Latin America. For decades, the United States had been the region's dominant external power. Now, another global power was becoming increasingly present. Unlike Washington, Beijing consistently emphasized a principle known as non-interference. In simple terms, China argued that countries should not intervene in the internal politics affairs of other sovereign states. For Beijing's perspective, Venezuela's political future should be decided by Venezuelans, not foreign governments. This approach also protected China's own foreign policy philosophy, because if outside powers could intervene whether they disagree with another government politics, China worried that the same logic could one day be applied to its own internal affairs. Meanwhile, Russia viewed Venezuela through yet another lens. Although Russia invested far less economically than China, its political and military support proved enormously significant. Russian companies invested in Venezuela's energy sector. The two governments expanded military cooperation. Russian aircraft visited Venezuela. Military advisors traveled there. And perhaps more importantly, Moscow repeatedly defended Maduro on the international stage, particularly at the United Nations. For President For President Putin, Supporting Venezuela wasn't simply about Latin America. It was about demonstrating that Russia remained a global power capable of challenging American influence far beyond Europe. In many ways, Venezuela became symbolic, a reminder that the post-Cold War world, where the United States often stood as the dominant global power, was beginning to change. 3 countries, 3 different visions of international order. The United States emphasized democracy, elections, and political accountability. China emphasized sovereignty and non-interference. Russia emphasized resistance to what it viewed as excessive American influence. Those competing visions collide dramatically in January 2019. On January 10, Nicolás Maduro was sworn in for the second presidential term following the 2018 election. The election itself had been highly controversial. Most of the opposition boycotted it. Several opposition leaders had been barred from running or were imprisoned or even exiled. Many countries, including the United States, Canada, members of the European Union, and several Latin American governments, questioned how legit the election was. Others, including Russia, China, Cuba, Turkey, and Iran, continued to recognize Maduro as Venezuela's president. Then, less than 2 weeks later, another dramatic moment unfolded. Juan Guaidó, the newly elected president of Venezuela National Assembly, declared himself interim president, arguing that the constitution allowed him to assume temporary leadership because he believed the presidency had been vacated through an illegitimate election. Almost immediately, the United States recognized Guaidó as Venezuela's president. Soon more than 50 governments followed, others refused. For a period of time, Venezuela effectively had 2 presidents recognized by different parts of the international community. It was an extraordinary moment in modern diplomacy. The world wasn't just debating what should happen in Venezuela, it was debating a much larger question. When democratic legitimacy is disputed, who decides who governs? The people, the courts, the constitutions, or the international community? There was no global consensus. And that disagreement exposed something much bigger than Venezuela itself. It exposed a changing international system, one where powerful countries increasingly competed not only through military strength or economic influence, but through competing ideas about democracy, sovereignty, and global leadership. By early 2019, Venezuela was no longer simply experiencing a political crisis. It had become one of the clearest examples of great power competition in the Western Hemisphere. And in many ways, that's exactly why this story matters. Because what happened in Venezuela wasn't isolated. It reflected a world that was becoming more divided, more competitive, and more uncertain. A world where rival powers inclusively saw even regional crises as opportunities to advance their own strategic interests. So, what does all of this actually tell us? We talk about oil, we talk about Hugo Chavez and Nicolás Maduro, we talk about economic collapse, political division, sanctions, and the competing interests of the United States, China, and Russia. But if we stop there, we miss the bigger picture. Because this history was never just about Venezuela. It's about what Venezuela reveals about the world we live in today. When the Cold War ended in 1991, many political scientists believed that the world was entering a new era. The Soviet Union had collapsed, the United States emerged as the world's only superpower, democracy appeared to be expanding across many regions, global trade increased, international organizations became more influential. In 1992, political scientist Francis Fukuyama argued that humanity might be witnessing what he called the end of history. He didn't mean the events would stop happening. Rather, he argued that liberal democracy had essentially won the great ideological competition of the 20th century. Many believe the future conflicts will become less common, that countries will become increasingly connected through globalization, that economic cooperation would replace geopolitical rivalry. For a while, it almost looked like they were right, but history had other plans. Over the past decade, the international system had changed dramatically. China has become the world's second largest economy and has expanded its political, economic, and diplomatic influence across nearly every continent. Russia has sought to rearrange itself as a major global power, particularly through military and strategic partnerships. Meanwhile, the United States has continued to defend its global influence while facing new challenges from emerging powers. Today, many scholars describe the war as entering a period of renewed great power competition. Not necessarily another Cold War, but something different. A world where powerful states compete economically, technologically, militarily, diplomatically, and sometimes even ideologically. This competition isn't always fought on battlefields. Sometimes it's fought through trade agreements, through infrastructure projects, through loans, through sanctions, through diplomacy, through information, and sometimes it's fought in countries like Venezuela. Venezuela became much more than an oil-producing nation facing a domestic crisis. It became a place where different visions of the international order collide. For the United States, supporting democratic institutions and applying pressure through sanctions became central to its Venezuela policy. For China, Venezuela represented an important economic partner and an opportunity to strengthen its presence in Latin America while defending the principle of non-interference. For Russia, supporting Maduro challenged American influence in a region long considered strategically important to Washington. So each country justified its actions very different. Each believed it was protecting important national interests, and that's something worth remembering. In international relations, countries rarely act out of pure altruism, nor do they act solely out of malice. They pursue what they perceive to be their interests. Sometimes those interests overlap, sometimes they collide. And when they collide, countries like Venezuela often find themselves caught in the middle. As I searched this project, I kept returning to one question. Could these have happened somewhere else? The answer is yes. Great power competition isn't unique to Venezuela. We see it in Ukraine, we see it in the South China Sea, we see it around Taiwan, we see it in parts of Africa where countries compete for access to critical minerals, we see it across the Arctic as climate change opens new shifting routes, different places, different stories, but similar patterns. Powerful countries competing for influence. Venezuela simply reminds us that Latin America is also part of that history. Too often, discussions about global politics focus almost exclusively on Europe or Asia. Latin America appears only when there's a crisis, but Venezuela demonstrates that the region has never been disconnected from global affairs. Its geography matters, its resources matters, its migration matters, its politics matter, and perhaps more importantly, its people matter. Throughout this episode, we talk about governments, presidents, oil companies, international organizations, sanctions, foreign policy, but behind every political decision, every economic policy, every diplomatic disagreement, there are real people. There are parents deciding whether they can afford food that week, students wondering if they'll be able to finish school, doctors trying to treat patients without enough medicine, families saying goodbye at airports and border crossings to ensure when they'll see one another again. Growing up in Venezuela was never just something I read about in the news. It was home, even when it wasn't physically there. It was a place my parents called after work, the place where my grandparents built their lives, the place that shaped my family's history. And like millions of Venezuelans living abroad, I watched from a distance as a country I know became the subject of headlines, debates, and political arguments. Sometimes those conversations reduce Venezuela to statistics, to inflation rates, to election results, to oil productions, to sanctions, to those numbers matter, policies matter, government matters, but they never tell the whole story because every statistic represents someone's life. Every migration number represents a family that made an incredible, difficult decision. Every policy debated in Washington, Beijing, or Moscow has consequences that are ultimately felt in homes, schools, hospitals, neighborhoods, thousands of miles away. That's why I chose this topic, not because I wanted to tell a story of one political crisis, but because I wanted to understand how global power shapes individual lives and how individual lives in turn reveal the true cause of geopolitical competition. This brings us back to the question we started with. How has Venezuela become a site of geopolitical competition among the United States, China, and Russia since 2013? The answer isn't simply because of oil, or because of one election, or because of one president. It's because Venezuela sits at the intersection of resources, geography, ideology, and international power. It reminds us that domestic crises rarely stay domestic in an interconnected world. And it reminds us that when great powers compete, smaller states often become the places where that competition plays out most visibly. But if episode 1 has focused on governments, episode 2 will focus on people. Because geopolitical competition isn't experienced by presidents, it's experienced by families, by migrants crossing borders, by students starting over in new countries, by children growing up between two homes. Next time, we'll follow the human side of the story. We'll explore how one of the largest displacement crises in modern history transformed not only Venezuela, but the entire region. We'll ask what happens when geopolitics becomes personal. And we'll hear how the struggle for power between nations can reshape the life of ordinary people. I'm Elisa Calderon Bracho. Thank you for listening to episode 1 of Venezuela and the Return of Great Power Rivalry. Thank you for listening to episode 1 of Venezuela and the Return of Great Power Competition. Until next time, take care.